So hey everybody, this is Dan,
And this is Ron.
and we're coming at you with a special short Anominy. I mean, I guess by definition, the Anominis are shorter than the full episodes, because otherwise, why would we call them Anominis? Um, but yeah, so I contacted Ron this morning because some huge news came out of the used video game market. There was an in-depth undercover or not really undercover. I mean, the guy's just using publicly available sources, but he's putting together a lot of dots by a guy whose name I am going to butcher. I'm not the first person to butcher his name on the internet this week, but I haven't heard him actually say it, so I don't know how it's pronounced. But Karl Jobst, he put up a video basically laying out how I guess to begin with, you may have heard in the last year or two, there have been a few enormously overpriced auction results for old sealed video games, particularly black box copies of NES Super Mario Brothers. There was a copy of Super Mario 64 that was sealed in a box and graded that went for $1.5 million. And Karl Jobst lays out how Wata Games, which is the big company or one of the big companies that does video game grading, literally didn't exist until 4 years ago, was started by one of the people at Heritage Auctions, and the people who were buying these giant auction results, like the $100,000 Super Mario Brothers a few years ago, are in fact people on the board of directors or who have very close financial ties to both Wata Games and Heritage Auctions. Namely, this is a pump and dump scam. A pump and dump scam, for those who are not familiar, is, and this is very common in the fine art world, but basically you buy an object, you put it up for auction, you either buy it directly if you can anonymously bid, or you hire somebody called a shill bidder to drive up bidding, and then on the agreement that you give them the money to actually pay for the thing, it goes back into your collection, but now there's a sale result saying, oh, somebody paid $100,000 for this thing.
Okay.
Because honestly, most finer, like when you hear about those $50 million sales for paintings, it's a giant tax dodge, right? You can say this is worth $50 million, but it's not going to get taxed the same way your house is.
Okay.
And, like nobody actually cares about Jeff Koons that much to pay that much. But you set up a few fake auction results and suddenly everybody's looking at the sales numbers. They don't necessarily know anything about art. In this case, these guys only became quote unquote video game collectors like 3 years ago. And then magically everything they're buying is shooting through the roof. And I think the first thing to lay out is that the number of video game related objects that are genuinely rare is minuscule. They're mass produced objects made for a mass market. A low production run of a video game could be anywhere close to like 400,000 copies. Right. And in the case of like Super Mario Brothers, we know for a fact that there are several million copies of this floating around, if you're not worried about it being sealed in a box. And part of several million copies of a thing being around is that there's a much higher likelihood that a lot of them are going to stay sealed in a box. Like maybe, even if it's 1% of a million is a lot of copies of something. So when a copy of Super Mario 64, which you figure like probably every person who owned a Nintendo 64, give or take, probably had a copy of Super Mario 64. Figure there's what I think there were like 32 million Nintendo 64s made. So figure maybe like some of the people didn't buy a copy, sure, but figure there's got to be bare minimum 15 million copies of this thing floating around.
Okay.
Less when you consider it boxed, less when you consider it in a sealed box, but either way, lots and lots and lots of these things. And so that going for $1.5 million is incredibly suspicious just based on that alone.
Okay.
It becomes even more suspicious when you compare it to comparable objects. So let's say like a first edition of Moby Dick by Herman Melville. We know the production numbers on that. There were only 3,000 of them made. They did not sell out in Melville's lifetime because nobody really gave a crap about Herman Melville until a few decades after he died. So you got to figure some of those were destroyed in the interim, right? Because this is a book that was published in small numbers in 1870 that was not considered important for the first 50 or so years it was in circulation. So it's not like people were taking great pains to preserve copies of Moby Dick in the early period of it being in circulation. A first edition of Moby Dick usually goes for about $20,000.
Gotcha. That's a little less
So
than 1 point whatever million.
versus $1.5 million for a thing where we know that their bare minimum are probably about 5,000 sealed copies of that floating around. And
Okay.
that's the thing that Jobst points out about Wata grading is that usually like for professional grading companies, a thing that they're not legally required to do, but they kind of have to do unless they're Wata games and they're just a giant scam front kind of thing, is a population report. Now, a population report is just a thing that says we've received X number of copies of this thing. These are the grades we gave them. So you have some idea of like how many of these things are actually in circulation. Wata does not release population reports because it is a pump and dump scam. In the case of Wata and Heritage Auctions, what it's strongly suggested and what a lot of eyewitnesses have reported, seeing these people not knowing who they were at video game conventions, flea markets and stuff, buying up a bunch of sealed games for seemingly no reason about 4 years ago.
Okay.
What's going on there is they don't want you to know that Super Mario 64, even in a sealed state, is a fairly common object. It is not a thing that is going to maintain a price of $1.5 million. And also, it's telling that, like Super Mario Brothers, one of the most popular games on the NES, there were 62 million NES consoles. So you got to figure there's at least a few thousand of these sealed floating around. Even if, you know, because I mean, like, granted, they're expensive at the time. Who's going to leave it sealed? But you also have things like, you know, somebody gets a birthday present they don't want, and it goes in a drawer for 20 years or whatever, right? That happens. And there's enough of them in circulation where you figure that happened to a decent number of them. And so you take something that's like relatively far more rare, like a Neo Geo video game, which, if you note, none of these heritage auctions results that we're hearing about are for actually or relatively actually rare video game. None of these things are as rare as a first edition of Moby Dick, but they're far more rare than a copy of Super Mario Brothers. The reason why they're pumping up these specific titles is because they probably have dozens of these things stockpiled. So you front the money the first time, and then other people who don't know what they're looking at look at the sales results and they're like, oh shit, you know, even if this goes for 800,000 or whatever, I'm getting a deal. And then, of course, the market gets flooded with copies. But after Heritage, Wata, etc., make money off of the grading fees, auction fees, and whatever copies they have stockpiled themselves.
Okay.
And then the market crashes, and then whoever got in late ends up holding the bag on these things that are not actually, I mean, the most that I think any video game, it's like an actually rare video game, let's say like the Nintendo World Championships cartridge, we know for a fact there's maybe 90 of those floating around. That's genuinely rare. The market cap on that is about $25,000, which is a far, far, far cry from $1.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And it has as much or more desirability than a copy of Super Mario 64 because it's an artifact of the very first esports event, essentially, the Nintendo World Championships in 1989. And they're not putting that stuff up because, again, you can't pump and dump unless the thing's actually relatively common.
Okay.
The other thing is that even if these things are rare, rarity does not equate to desirability inherently.
You always hear when we're talking about these kind of markets, I want it old and I want it rare. Isn't that everything?
It's well, I mean,
I want the only one.
If it's an unusual object with so let's take a thing that is vastly more rare than a sealed copy of Super Mario 64 and an object that I happen to know the exact production numbers on because I was the guy who paid to have them printed, the book that I wrote and published. There are 1,000 copies of that were printed. I've been handing them out like party favors, so I can't imagine people have been taking great care of them universally.
Again, I happen to have a copy right here.
Exactly. And so there's 1,000 of those. And let's say tomorrow, let's say I had $1 million to hand Ron, and I said, Ron, go out and buy a copy of my book for $1 million. Here, I'm going to give you the $1 million. You're going to buy it for me, so I get the $1 million back. You can keep the book as payment, right? And then I go out sending press releases about some jackass bought Dan Levine's book about Occupy Wall Street for $1 million. Right. And that's why the first thing they did with all these heritage auctions, they start sending out press releases. Journalists as high as like the Washington Post and stuff, they're just like, oh, all right, yeah, makes sense, whatever. Even though it makes literally no sense. And yeah, does that make my book, which I mean, I think market value on my book, if you go on Amazon, is probably like $5, even with the rarity. Like, I think it was going for $30 for like a week or two because somebody called me about it, but like
the list
dropped
price
off precipitously.
The list price is $10.
And when I was selling them, when I did the book tour, I was lucky if I was getting 8. I was like reverse haggling with people. And so Ron does this. There's suddenly everybody's like, whoa, this book I never heard of. Somebody paid $1 million for it. Does that make my book actually worth $1 million? No, because there is no, in order to establish demand and to establish an actual price, you need multiple sales. You need the sales to be not to speculators. Basically, you need somebody who wants the thing bad enough to pay that much. You need 2 people that want it bad enough to pay that much. And you need neither of them can be speculators because the speculator is just going to drop the copy right back into the market. So it's not actually like being taken out of circulation or adding to the rarity of the object. Because the other thing I should say is that rarity is relative to you know, like there could be a million copies of something. If nobody wants to sell, then it's technically rare in circulation, right? Like prices will go up. Um, all these assholes over fucking Wata and Heritage Auctions, they're literally talking about in these press releases, like, yeah, we're just going to auction it off again in like 2-3 years. And yeah, so like, when you go out and buy stuff, think, I mean, I guess the key questions I ask myself when I buy stuff, and I should have prefaced this whole thing with, I have been buying and selling used objects for 10 years. That's my bread and butter until the podcast starts making ungodly amounts of money. Which, I mean, we got good, the graph looks good these days, but, for now, I'm still doing the used stuff.
Wait, that's how I've been paying rent.
You've been paying your rent with the podcast?
Yeah. Don't you get any of the Patreon money?
No, I didn't know we had a Patreon.
Is this a good time to plug our Patreon?
Yeah, let's plug our Patreon. I didn't even know there was a Patreon.
Well, we don't have one. I just thought this might be a good time to plug one if we did.
Yeah, well, okay. If you think we're worth giving money to, like, convince us to start a Patreon, because, like, I will gladly take your money.
Our Kickstarter is going strong, though.
I mean, I did get some money on Kickstarter once, but and you can check that out on episode 50 of the podcast.
I'll do that.
So yeah, so when I go out and I'm trying to buy stuff and I'm buying stuff to make a living off of it versus just crap that I like having in my house that I know that I'm not going to sell. The first things I got to ask myself are, does anybody want this? So Super Mario Brothers, sure, yeah, somebody's going to want that. It's an iconic character. There's probably some demand, but it's not going to be enough to drive it up to $1.5 million. Number two, is it in decent condition? People do care about condition. At the same time, when you're dealing with actual collectors and not speculators, once you get past the point of like, this looks nice and it's complete, condition's not really that important. Like, the difference between a 9.4 and a 9.8 is only important to speculators. Number three, is it number three, and I'm putting this third for a reason, but is it actually rare in any capacity? So rarity can be determined. So rarity kind of, there's like layers to it, right? Because you can have, like, let's say I have a copy of Moby Dick over here. This looks fancy. Pretty sure they sold these at Barnes & Noble by the thousands. This is extremely common. If you just need a physical copy of Moby Dick to look at, and you paid more than $5, you got bilked. Now, if you're buying a copy of Moby Dick, if you're buying a first edition of Moby Dick, that's a different state. That's much more rare. And that's about, the historical value of the object, not any use value to the object. Because chances are, you buy a first edition of Moby Dick, you're going to look at it once, and then you're going to have like the fear of God's going to be in you about ever touching it because you just spent $20,000 on the thing, right? Like the most expensive books I own are the books that I touch and look at the least, right? Because it's sort of like, it's like driving a new car off the lot, right?
Yeah,
that's where you get like the real OCD people, right? And yeah, the other thing to think is, like, if there is a lot of desire for the thing now, is that desire going to have any kind of staying power if you're trying to invest long term? So, like, 20 years ago, Atari 2600 games, you could get 15, 20, hundreds sometimes of dollars per Atari 2600 game. None of these things are rare. These are all extremely common, but everybody that grew up with the Atari 2600 came of the age where they have disposable income at that point. So you have an overflooded buyer's market. Also, 20 years ago, there weren't as many ways to look up actual like auction results and reasonable pricing guides. So you could kind of get more for the stuff than maybe it was actually worth. Now, if I go to a video game convention, I could pick up a tub of hundreds upon hundreds of Atari 2600 games, probably pay less than $1 a piece, if that.
The same ones that went for hundreds and thousands.
Yeah, there's like 10 or 15 Atari 2600 games that are actually like exceptionally rare. Like there's 3 copies in existence. Those still go for some money because, yeah, the rarity, even if there's not that much demand, you only need 4 people willing to pay that much for it to actually take on that value in sale histories.
Okay.
The rest of it, it's just sort of like, okay, you know, I paid a bunch of crap because of peer pressure, and now I'm left holding the bag on a bunch of stuff that's at least commercially junk. You know, you can still plug it into your Atari if your Atari still works, and you know, you can play some Pitfall or whatever. But if you were expecting that to send your kids through college, then I got some bad news for you. Same thing with NES games. NES games, they were all spiking about 5 years ago. And now, except for the stuff that's extremely uncommon, which there really isn't very much of it for the NES, or the stuff that's getting pump and dumped, you know, like because Jim Halperin is buying back his own copies over and over again. It's all dropping because those people have kids. They got bigger shit on their mind than NES games. And, you know, they had their fun. They picked it up. The people that wanted whatever, that were hardcore collectors, they have all the common stuff by now and they don't need it. They're not going to enter the market again as buyers to get a second set of NES games.
Okay.
And that market's never going to come back. It's not like just generally there's not going to be some kind of giant run on NES games. The further out we get, like you talk to somebody who's 15 about the NES right now, they're like, oh, that's neat, right? Right. They don't have some kind of intense emotional connection to it. They're not going to be willing to pay that kind of money even for really rare stuff. So the buyers are not going to replace themselves. These are extremely common objects. And eventually a large proportion of them are going to get dumped back into the market. You're probably going to be buying tubs of NES games the same way that you can buy tubs of Atari 2600 games right now. For, you know, maybe $2 a game, if that.
Gotcha.
Unless it's something really special. And yeah, so that, I guess, just when you go out and you buy stuff, I know it's exciting, but just think to yourself, like, never spend money that you're not comfortable losing in its entirety. Think of it kind of like you're going to the casino. Number 2, you know, think rationally about this stuff. Don't presume that your emotional attachment to an object has anything to do with the larger world without doing research first.
So are you saying that not everyone is going to pay hundreds of thousands for the complete collection of Kurt Vonnegut paperbacks?
No, you
editions.
might want to look into Roth IRAs, Ron.
Oh, okay. Oh, wait, I thought I'm retiring on these. I thought I was set for life. What am I supposed to do now? It's too late.
I mean, that one I gave you that has the advanced publisher slip. The other thing is, yeah, like it's the ceiling is whatever somebody's willing to pay for, right? So like here, I'm pretty sure I have the only copy in existence of this book. This is a terrible book, but the cover's great. The Necrophiles.
Yeah, that's a great,
Awful
great
book.
title.
I would be lucky if I put this up on the internet for 2 years and I got $20 for it.
You need to find someone who also finds the title funny enough to shell out some money for it.
Well, I'd have to find 2 people.
Oh, so that they bid up against each other?
And that's a good negotiating tip too, because like you could have something really rare and I could be the only person in the world that gives a shit. We have equal negotiating leverage at that point if you really want to get rid of the thing until there's another person that really wants the thing.
And that's why I need a shill.
Right.
Okay. Or you need a shill in order for me to pay you to pay you lots of cash for that book. Got it.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the only way I'm going to get rid of the other 400 copies of my book out of my garage.
So parting thoughts, since we started with Heritage and Wata, are they going to jail?
So apparently on Twitter, Karl Jobst, whatever his name is, he says that since he put up that video 3 days ago, he's been getting an enormous number of, like, everybody's coming out of the woodwork to give him information.
Oh, wow.
So if that information, I mean, I think the information now is actionable because the thing with the coins in the 80s that also involved Jim Halperin, they ended up getting fined $1.2 million by the FTC.
Okay.
For like pumping up the coin market.
Okay.
I think this is gonna, like, Wata game certification. If they don't put up a population report, I would say their days being in business are numbered. Okay. Because nobody, like a grading company, if you can't try, and there's like other stuff he shows in that, like he shows a game that was given an A+ seal and it looks like fucking moths ate it. There's like holes in it. There's like games that clearly had mold on them where they didn't state the mold and gave them like an 8.0.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you can't, the only reason you would go to a grading company is because their reputation is above reproach. Their reputation is everything. If the reputation goes out the window, which I think that ship has sailed, yeah, then everybody that bought grading services from Wata or bought games that were graded by Wata specifically because they were graded by Wata, I mean, you still got a video game, right? But that value drops to the floor overnight, probably. And one last thing to say about graded video games, they put them in those like plastic slabs, right? Mm-hmm. Hard plastic slabs. A lot of old video games have save batteries, right? Like the only way you could save a game on the NES or the Game Boy is it has a little watch battery inside the cartridge. Uh-huh. Those blow up. They corrode the circuit board. Chances are, if you bought like a graded sealed version of Pokemon, that's Pokemon for Game Boy, you could save on that, right? If nobody opens the seal, takes that out, and switches out the battery, none of those games are going to be playable in about 15 years. Not kidding.
I'm sorry to everyone out there.
True story.
I'm sorry to everyone out there who's gotten their cartridges graded and sealed.
Yeah, if you got Pokemon, you got like Super Nintendo Zelda that has a save battery. That's going to be a bunch of like red gunk on top of a circuit board in 10 years. Yeah, so, be smart, be cautious, have fun, and fuck the speculators. And I guess I'm still Dan.
And I'm still Ron.
And we will, I guess we'll see you at the flea market this time.
Yeah, I can manage that. All right. Take care, everyone.
Take care.